Combine continues progressing as it is day 2 of the Combine, as we went from talking to coaches and players, and the workouts are to come and much, much more. Welcome into another NFL Combine edition of the Strictly Stripes podcast. Muhammad Ahmad here with you in Indy, alongside Mike Nislik and Andrew Gillis. And guys, what made today being Wednesday so interesting is, we already talked to Duke Tobin and Zach Taylor. We broke that down the other day. And now we got Lou Anarumo. We got Darren Simmons, Brian Callahan, and even Frank Pollock. And I want to kind of talk about some interesting things they said and to kind of get your all's thoughts on it. And, of course, we'll sort of set the stage for some names to watch tomorrow with the workouts officially kicking off at Lucas Oil Stadium. I want to start with Lou Anarumo because he was one of the first coordinators to speak, and because on top of the fact that, we've mentioned him being back for his fifth straight season with Brian Callahan, there's one thing that interested me with Lou Anarumo today, and, he said that what stood out to him this year with the defense was consistency. He said that that's what he wants to keep into next year. Of course, one thing that wasn't so consistent, as we've talked about on this podcast, was the pass rush and getting to the quarterback. He said that he likes to add rushers like he likes to add corners, but that he's not very worried about the pass rush because he said that, are we, we being the Bengals, are we number 1 in QBR? Oh, I think so. I double-checked, and the Bengals were actually third in opposing, I should add. They were third in opposing QBR. So he was close. Andrew was close. So he does make a point in that, yeah, they did get to the quarterback, but is he downplaying what they need in the pass rush, or are we just maybe reading too much into the pass rush not being effective last year?
I think you can kind of make a point that, not to just kind of repeat what every scout or coach or general manager will tell you, but I mean, it really is true that you can never have enough pass rushers. I think you could always kind of look for improvements there. I don't know how many teams, there are a few positions, Frank Pollock kind of mentioned them today, offensive line, DBs, like you can kind of pick some positions of, guys you can really just never have enough of, and or positions you really never want to stop trying to improve at. And pass rush is certainly one of them. If you can get after the passer, you can do a lot. But not only in the run game or up front, but kind of in your secondary too. So, I think that when you have a unit that was good, I think it's fair to call them, anywhere from average to good. The Bengals pass rush, you obviously want to improve that. They're trying to get to another level. I think there's an interesting discussion of how and kind of if the guys that they have can do that, make it a truly elite pass rush like they would want it to be. But I think to me, you're just kind of looking at something where he's saying, we always want to get better and we always try to improve in the pass rush.
Well, I think the drop-off, too, was pretty substantial from that first group to the second group. I think they have very good pass rushers, but I don't think their pass rush was necessarily consistently effective. And part of that QBR rating in terms of production was, the secondary was pretty effective at times, too. So, that's not all on the defensive line. I just think that they could use a guy in that second group, especially since, Sam Hubbard and Trey Hendrickson both miss games, and it's hard that those guys take a beating, that they need some added not depth, but I mean, I think like star power in terms of like a guy that can get to the quarterback, because I just don't think they have that when Sam Hubbard and Trey Hendrickson have to come off the field, or when DJ Reader came out the field, it made it harder on Sam Hubbard and Trey Hendrickson. So I think I get what Lou is saying. He's saying that they, I think, are effective, but also can scheme around those things. But I think that, they could make that life easier on themselves too.
He was asked about kind of what he said to Joseph Osai, at the end of the year because of what happened at the end of the conference championship game. And, he said that he hugged him. He told him to move on from it. And I think he was asked, do you think Osai could be a starter if, you hypothetically didn't have Hubbard or Hendrickson, or say you put him on another team without those guys? And he said maybe. And I actually agree with that. I think it's definitely possible. But, I think, like you said, Mike, there's good pass rushers. They just need to work around that scheme. And again, like the good thing with the combine is tomorrow being Thursday, defensive linemen, edge rushers, and interior guys are all going to be working out. So they're going to have a really close eye on that position, on Thursday. But I think also when you think about the fact that, Lou Anarumo and Brian Callahan, to get to Callahan here, they both interviewed for coaching positions, both with the Cardinals, Callahan with the Colts. Anarumo said he was a little disappointed he didn't get the Cardinals job, but he's more excited to be back in Cincinnati. And it seems like, one thing I think that Callahan talked about that I wanted to get to is, when you're interviewing for a job like that, like he was for the Indianapolis Colts job, and ironically we're in Indy, right? He talks about that being in Indy, and, it kind of gives you a broader sense of like how to view an organization, how to view a franchise structurally, not just from a roster building standpoint. I mean, how do you maybe see Callahan and Anarumo bringing in their own special juice? Like, obviously doing what they've been doing, but maybe adding to that. You think maybe there's something that they've kind of learned from this offseason that they'll apply moving forward into 2023?
What do you mean by that? Like, that they've taken from what? Like their interviews is what you're saying? Like,
right. Like, do you think just being in those like interviews, like being in those like processes, like do you think they learn anything that they can maybe apply just to like building on next season and making it better?
What would that even look like? I mean, you
just
do
as far as like just schemes or just.
Well, yeah, but they're not learning schemes from the people they're interviewing with. They're doing a 2-hour Zoom interview.
Like looking for players, for example. Like obviously that's more of a Duke Tobin scouting thing, but maybe like looking for certain players at certain positions, like pass rush, like we talked about, or offensive line, which we're going to get to as well. Like,
but that's not part of the job process. Like they're not searching for a player.
I don't know if I think that's applicable if you're talking about interviewing for a coordinator position or kind of down the hierarchy. Like if you're a quarterback's coach interviewing for an offensive coordinator job, and you're moving over to, you're moving over to talk to the head coach of a team and the head coach of a team or assistant head coach, whoever it is, and you're talking scheme with them, I think you can kind of do that. I think you can kind of learn some stuff. But, if you're interviewing for a head coach, I don't know what kind of lessons you can take from that. I mean, I think the bigger point is that you've got two guys who the league clearly values, at least in some way, as a potential head coach in the future. And, I mean, you've still got them on staff. So to me, I don't know if you can really learn anything from that.
It's interesting because, again, I kind of looked at it as like, I mean, you're not necessarily – I'm not saying it's like, oh, you're learning to be like a GM, but like when you kind of talk to those GMs and those owners and you kind of see what they look for in a coach, then maybe they kind of learn some things like, oh, maybe a team looks for this or looks for that, and maybe they apply that to strategy and scheming. And again, we're not in those meetings. We're not in those interviews. I'm just being hypothetical here. But with Callahan, just getting back to the X's and O's, one of the big things he talked about was Joe Mixon. He kind of just said the same thing he usually says, which is that, they're focused on efficiency in the run game. He thought he got that from Mixon, and part of why maybe it might have dropped was because of the, snap count or how many reps he got, getting snaps in game. But that he wants to use the offseason to just build on that, to be more efficient and to get that consistency. Did you guys maybe get the sense that they're willing to keep Mixon, but maybe have like a Mixon rookie running back punch? Or what do you kind of take from Callahan just talking about, the future with Mixon, which, obviously he's not the one deciding whether he stays or goes, but assuming you have him, do you think maybe they're comfortable with him, like with a kind of another running back behind him?
I think the answer was pretty clear that, you have to read between the lines, but that
right.
if he restructures his deal, like there's probably something to be said, but it might be hard to bring him back on that full salary, just given his production and things. And so, I think the option would be then to draft a rookie running back. I don't think they, looking at the free agents, I'm not sure there's anybody that really fits kind of the bill what they're looking for. I think Callahan laid out the qualities they're looking for. I mean, obviously, I think explosiveness is the top of the list, and so guys that can get to the second level, guys that can break tackles, guys that have that kind of second level speed. And so, I think that's probably the direction they're going in. But I think they'd be willing to bring back Joe Mixon, like I said, at a lower cost, just because they're in a cap-saving mode to kind of afford what they can afford. And Mixon, I think, is at a spot in his career where he's probably not worth $13 million or what was it, 12 something.
12 something, I believe.
13.13.
There you go.
He's going to be against the cap next year. So, yeah, I mean, I agree with Mike. I think you kind of look at this and, I mean, not kind of, not to go unstated, Samaje Perine's also a pending free agent too.
Of course, right.
So I understand that it's just a backup running back, but if it kind of feels like you could really kind of reset the running back position if you wanted to. What you could, like if you can cut Mixon and let Perine go, and then all of a sudden you're kind of starting over at running back, kind of like you're at like where you're at tight end, at least right now. I think that there's a couple different ways you could do it. But you would assume that they would like to have this kind of figured out in the next 2 or so weeks because, Samaje Perine and Joe Mixon and, the explosiveness that, Brian Callahan and some of the other guys were talking about. I mean, those are pretty clearly different archetypes for running back. So you kind of want to have an idea of what you're going after.
And that's kind of why I mentioned that as like, is it Mixon and then a rookie, or is it completely different? Because like you said, Perine's a free agent. So is it like you let him walk, get someone for just as cheap in the draft? Because we're in the combine this week, which is fitting. So you got all those names that come up that we've talked about, and then, like Mike said, do you kind of restructure him? Because we can all agree he's not worth the 13.1 mil that Andrew pointed out. And I think Mixon's at a point where like, he knows he might not get the same anywhere else, or, I mean, he might get the same money somewhere else, but why not just take it coming back to a team that you're familiar with, that's just as familiar with you? Again, we'll see what happens and how that plays out in free agency and with the draft, but I really think that's a very realistic scenario. And if you kind of read between the lines, like Mike said, that's really, I think, what you take away from that. Another thing I thought that was interesting before we go to break is with Callahan, he talked about, Hayden Hurst and how, and he said this like, respectfully, like, he didn't expect the explosiveness that he saw from Hayden Hurst, is how he put it, to kind of paraphrase. And I think that's where Hayden Hurst really marketed himself and made a case for being one of the better tight ends in league. Obviously, maybe not like top 5, but just one of the better guys at his position. And I think it really shows just how much they want him and how much they value him in that offense. But of course, it all comes down to like, and Mike and I talked about this a few weeks ago. What does Hayden Hurst want? What is he looking for? Does he want the money? Does he just want somewhere to be home? When you kind of see how Callahan and that offense values him, does it maybe kind of lend you to think maybe you lean in the direction of thinking that Hayden Hurst has a good shot of maybe choosing to stay in Cincinnati and being with an offense that values that explosiveness he brings?
Well, I thought kind of like Mike said, you kind of have to read between the lines with the Mixon answer. I think you can kind of read between the lines at least a little bit on this one. They liked what Mitchell Wilcox did as a backup tight end. So if you're going to re-sign him, he's restricted. So, there's a bunch of different parameters. It's not free for all for the other teams. So, if you want to bring back him, it would be relatively easy. But then with Hayden Hurst, they talked about kind of the development process for tight ends and how it takes a little bit longer for tight ends to kind of do that in an NFL world. And if you're going to bring a tight end in, specifically a rookie tight end, I mean, I don't know how many tight ends are coming in and immediately kind of having that impact. You think of like a Darnell Washington, like, okay, he was a backup tight end at Georgia. That's because the guy in front of him is great, but is he ready for a starting role in the NFL? Is Dalton Kincaid ready? Like, you can kind of go down the list, and if this team wants to win now, kind of like they indicated yesterday with the Higgins stuff and everything that they talked about, I think you can kind of say that, if it's not Hurst, I think you could make a pretty compelling case that it's a veteran tight end.
Yeah, I think they want somebody that could contribute right away, and I think Hayden Hurst fits that bill. I think it'll depend on what he's looking for salary-wise, because there's probably a number that they can't reach up to. I think Duke Tobin said that basically with a lot of these guys, if they're, not willing to maybe take a little bit less, or at least, a more modest number than what maybe they could get at like top dollar value, then like a lot of these, it's going to be tough just because there's not enough cash to spread around. So, I think they want him back, but that number's still got to be right. And I think that's kind of the looming question mark over all these 19 free agents, it's like, can we make it all fit together? And I think that's the challenge Duke Tobin talked about yesterday, that they've got a lot of questions, and it's hard to make all that math work.
Yeah, and like that's why I kind of mentioned, Hayden Hurst, because like he's a big part of that question mark of, what's going to happen in free agency. But speaking of question marks, when we come back, we're going to talk about some question marks on special teams, because as much as we've talked about it, there's a lot more question marks we need to discuss. Plus, we'll set the stage for Thursday's workouts and the rest of the weekend when we come back right here on the Strictly Stripes podcast. Hey there, it's Muhammad Ahmad from the Strictly Stripes podcast. You might be wondering, what exactly is Cincinnati Football Insider? Well, it's a community of fans who want the inside scoop on the Bengals and a direct connection to the Strictly Stripes podcast and the reporters who cover the team, and that would be me, Andrew Gillis, and Mike Neislick. It works like this. Andrew, Mike, and I will text your phone a few times a day with breaking news, analysis, and our insights on the Bengals. It's the inside scoop on what we're hearing, and we'll give you the inside word before it even hits social media. Being an insider is the best way to participate with the podcast and get in on special events and Zoom calls with me, Mike, and Andrew. And the best part is you can text us directly. It's a great way to cut through the clutter of Facebook, Twitter, other social media, and avoid the trolls for just $4.99 a month. Still not sure? Well, just try it for 2 weeks, and if you don't like it, you can text the word STOP at any time, but you won't want to cancel once you join the community of hardcore Bengals fans. Here's the best way to get on board. Go to cleveland.com/Bengals, click on the blue banner at the top of the page, or if it's easier, text 513-940-4193. It's a great time to try the 2 weeks free, as we'll be reporting live from the NFL Combine in Indianapolis. Plus, we'll be covering free agency on the way to the NFL Draft in April. Give us a try for 2 weeks and see what you think. Just text this number again. It's 513-940-4193 and become an insider today. And thanks for staying with us on the Strictly Stripes podcast. So we talked about the big things from Lou Anarumo, from Brian Callahan, as far as things that matter going into the offseason and free agency. Before the break, I mentioned special teams because we did talk to Darren Simmons, who's entering, believe it or not, his 21st season as Bengals special teams coordinator, that's amazing. I still can't believe that. But he knows a thing or two about special teams, which shows that. There's a lot of interesting things he talked about with, punter, and the biggest thing to kind of back up what Zach Taylor said that I forgot to mention, which is that, they welcome competition at punter. We talked about Drew Chrisman already. We kind of did that position review last week, the highs and the lows, literally and figuratively. But yeah, I think it makes sense to bring in competition given that, he didn't play football for a year in some way just because he was a free agent, and then kind of gets thrown into an interesting spot midway through the year. So I think it makes sense to bring in competition, for him. We already mentioned some names prospect-wise that, are worth watching at the Combine. I already listed them out, but to kind of get to it, how much confidence do you have that, whoever the Bengals bring in? Well, actually, let me start with this first. Do you get the sense that maybe, this is crazy to think, but like if you're in the 7th round and there's a punter on the board, could you see the Bengals actually going for that? Is that a crazy thought, or could that actually be a real idea?
No, I think Simmons kind of said that that's not really on the table. He said that the depth in this draft isn't very good, so you wouldn't waste a 7th-round pick when you can get him as an undrafted free agent.
He was talking about punters or kick returners? Because he did say that. He was talking about punters when he said that? Okay, I thought he meant kick returners. My bad. Got you. So then as far as competition goes, they're going to bring someone in no matter who it is. Do you envision that, maybe this is a bold prediction because we don't know who the person is, but how hard is it going to be for Drew Chrisman to keep his job? Like, do you think maybe he showed that he's vulnerable to not being the starting guy next year? Or I guess how vulnerable?
Yeah, to me, like, Chrisman came in and, obviously Kevin Huber and Clark Harris are going to move on, and they played a lot of games. So, like, it kind of felt like a passing of the torch, and you really kind of looked at it and were like, okay, now it's Chrisman's time, and he just never like Simmons said today, he had some good punts, and there were some spots where he kind of bailed them out, but to me, there was just never a moment where you were like, okay, now he's fully asserted himself as the team's punter. Like, he didn't pin, there's not really like a moment in your mind where, okay, in this game, he really flipped field position and really played a big part in a win. So, I mean, whenever you're a young guy like that, trying to establish yourself and you don't kind of have those moments, yeah, I mean, I think, every position in the NFL really is, or most of them are up for grabs every training camp. And, especially punter, if you're not doing what you need to be doing.
Yeah, I mean, he's the guy on a minimum contract type of deal. I mean, I would expect that they could easily find competition, and that could easily flip the position. Flip who's the starter.
And as far as other positions, I mean, he sounded pretty set on Cal Adamitis. We talked about that contract he signed. Of course, he's the only long snapper on the team, so they might want to have some depth or at least someone on the practice squad. But he's the guy. Looks like the end of Clark Harris in Cincinnati has pretty much come, so we already mentioned that. But kick returner, punt returner, sort of an interesting area because Trent Taylor is a free agent, and he was very high on Trent Taylor. Simmons said that Taylor had one of the best years of his career at punt returner. Kick returner is also a concern because you have Travion Williams, who's a free agent. They have Brandon Wilson, who was a returner 2 years ago, but ever since he tore his ACL midway in 2021 and basically missing all of last year, they've had to rely on Williams, Chris Evans, who's kind of been a question mark with his own injuries and just kind of issues he's had offensively and just running the ball. So, how much do you think they look at that, in the combine? I mean, like you said, they're not going to draft a punter. The depth isn't really there at punter. Could say the same about kick return or punt return. I mean, how much do you think they address that? Do you think it's more about just keeping Trent Taylor and settling him in? Do you keep Travion Williams and hope that he can do it? Or do you try to see if Chris Evans is up for it and then maybe have someone behind him to compete for that? How do you kind of assess that?
It depends on the running back situation, I think. Because like I said, with P. Ryan and Mixon, like, if you're going to bring in a guy who is a burner, there you go. There's your third down running back. There's your kind of scat back who's also going to return kicks and punts maybe for you. So I think it depends on that. If you feel okay with, maybe you sign somebody in free agency, like I think it kind of depends what happens at running back to me. And I think you're kind of, you're going to be able to find out your answer, kind of what they do there.
Also, I didn't think he was quite as high on Trent Taylor as you did. He said that he had a career year, but also said that they put out the ball on the ground multiple times and how unacceptable that was and how bad that was. And that was a sort of direct criticism. Like, yeah, you could be productive, but you can also, it doesn't matter, because he said the goal is to give the ball to the ref. So I think that that's not sort of a ringing endorsement. I didn't think Travion Williams got a ringing endorsement. He basically said they were forced on that because Chris Evans was made inactive because of other decisions on the roster. You don't draft for special teams, I don't think, but it's like an extra plus for like a receiver or for a guy in the secondary that can do those things well. He said, hopefully they land somebody that has the versatility to do both. So it's not something you're like, I'm drafting a punt returner here. You're drafting a wide receiver with those skills. And so I think that's a factor, certainly, because I don't think that they got the production that they wanted in either spot.
And it all just kind of ties back to the running back situation, like Andrew mentioned. What happens in that room with a free agent like Travion, and what they decide to do as far as like if they want to pick a running back in the draft, what kind of versatility that XYZ running back brings. But to kind of wrap up here before we set the stage for the week, I did want to get to Frank Pollock. He talked a lot about just the moving parts on the line, all the injuries that we've had no shortage of discussions of. And I know you guys kind of talked to him about like kind of what the anticipation is with Jonah, with Lyle Collins, who I think is the biggest question mark on the offensive line right now. And of course, what did Jackson Carman, show at left tackle, and what can he show going into next year? I guess from talking to him, just because he talked about so many things, I just want to jump into you guys and ask, what do you make of kind of for what Frank Pollock assessment of the offensive line is, and like how much do you think changes or doesn't change just based on what he presented to the media today?
Well, Frank's not in a position to sort of change it. He's sort of basically said, we'll live with what we got until I think it's different because, I mean, that's really his job. I still think the uncertain, Jonah Williams, I think in terms of his long-term prospects for the team, I think it's interesting. Just, I don't get the sense that they're in a rush to sign him, and that I think is interesting going forward with that group. I'm not sure what it means for next year. I mean, obviously, I don't think they're going to move him to right tackle, it looks like. So, but beyond that, I think that's the interesting question. To me, I think La'el Collins you release, but I think they have more medical information and probably more comfortable with kind of where that situation's at. And we just don't know that part of it.
Yeah, I know this isn't what you asked, but I thought one of the more interesting quotes about the offensive line today actually came from Brian Callahan. Callahan got asked, how do you feel about the other four guys, aside from Collins? And, in his answer, he said with Jonah, where he's at contractually, you're always looking for guys where you have one eye toward the future and what that looks like, whether it's him or somebody else. So to me, that kind of illuminated the fact that, the Bengals are kind of looking at this situation like they might need two tackles at some point in the near future, whether that's, a year from now or, this year. Like, I think that, to me, that kind of indicated that they are maybe more open to tackle than we thought in the draft, and we kind of knew that they were interested already. So the tackle position to me, I know it didn't come from Frank, but when you talk to everybody in kind of totality, put everything together, that position really kind of rose above today.
Yeah, I think, Andrew, what you said about that, I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me as far as where they want to go with that. And, I'll keep saying what Duke Tobin said because, I mean, it's cliche, but it's true. Like, you can never have an offensive lineman in any league, including the NFL. And I think any team, no matter how good or bad they are, would love to have an additional blocker on either side of the ball, left or right, inside or outside, but especially outside at tackle because that's where, a lot of these concerns come from for the Bengals, more specifically at right tackle. But to kind of just wrap up and put a bow on this fine Wednesday, moving on to the rest of the week, we have the defensive linemen and the linebackers working out Thursday. Those will be the first two position groups working out, and then you have every other position group working out respectively from Friday through Sunday. I think that's going to be an interesting group because we've kind of talked about, do the Bengals need more juice at pass rush? And we'll see, are there maybe some mid-round guys, maybe not projects, but somewhere between like a starter and a project that maybe the Bengals could or should have their eyes on? We'll take a look at that tomorrow, along with the linebackers. And there's one linebacker who we've mentioned on this podcast. People probably know about that. I want to talk more about tomorrow because he had some interesting tidbits for the media on Wednesday that I think the Bengals should pay attention to, and much, much more. And we'll fill you in on what other prospects say in the coming days this week. But once again, for myself, Mike Neislick, and Andrew Gillis, I'm Muhammad Ahmad. Stay tuned with us as we bring you the Combine news you need to know.